Hello, and welcome to the Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council Europe Center's internet show and podcast, where we talk about some of the most pressing issues impacting the transatlantic relationship today. My name is Rizzo. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center based in Washington, but today calling in from Berlin. And my guest today, I'm thrilled to welcome to the show, Ed Owen, founder of the Power Test podcast. Ed, a warm welcome to the show.
Hello, good to be here.
Thanks for being with us. So last week, the Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago. It was watched closely, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, as we are about 70 or so days away now from the presidential election. And there are potentially two sort of differing visions about what the U.S.-Europe relationship would look like under a potential Trump presidency or under a Harris presidency. We talked about this after the Republican National Convention, where we hosted the Munich Security Conference's Nico Lange. So now I want to talk to you about some of the takeaways on the questions about the United States and Europe based on your experience on the ground, on the sidelines of the Democratic National Convention. So jumping right into it, that's kind of my opening question. What were your impressions? What kind of conversations were you having in Chicago, especially those related to the U.S. and Europe?
Well, it was my first Democratic convention. I've followed American politics for many years, but it's my first time. So being in Chicago and seeing it up close was fascinating. I mean, it was and I suppose particularly for me who spent a lot of time in Labour Party conferences in the UK, the convention had conventions always have this, don't they? But particularly this year with the extraordinary events of the last few weeks, it had the vibe of a revivalist meeting in the great American tradition, and there was extraordinary positive mood from within the activist base within the Democrat Party, which feels a lot of heady talk of that Kamala Harris was representing a new movement that was going to sweep the Democrats to the White House in November. Now, I think a lot of that was based on just an outpouring of relief in a way that they now have a candidate that the activist base and the supporters and the community of Democrats can feel they can go positively forward to the electorate with. But it was a fascinating event to observe and to see that level of I won't call it a cult. It was not a cult, but it was certainly extraordinarily enthusiastic. Lots of joy, as we heard from Bill Clinton and from Michelle Obama. Lots of references to joy, and that certainly came across thick and fast through the week. In terms of the discussion around Europe, I mean, there was obviously the focus of the convention was on domestic politics. But of course, foreign policy, transatlantic relationship, the war in Ukraine was a constant feature in the background, and certainly a unified view about the importance of NATO, the importance of transatlantic security. Kamala Harris herself made a very strong statement of support of Ukraine in her speech to the convention on the Thursday. So the positive aspect from the European perspective is that there is from the Harris perspective a strong overt support for those issues.
I mean, I think a few of the conversations that we've had at the Atlantic Council, not just even over the last few months, but for the last year as the election has really ramped up, is sort of kind of what I mentioned in my opening, which is about these sort of differing visions about the U.S.-European relationship that may come to pass under either a Trump presidency or a Harris presidency. And there's been a lot of fear and nervousness amongst Europeans about what a potential Trump presidency might mean for Europe. And the conversations that we've had have always been about Biden, right? Because he, obviously was the candidate up until just, less than a couple months ago. He's extremely transatlanticist in his approach. He reassured Europeans as soon as he came into office. Would you expect the same approach from Kamala Harris, or do you see the U.S.-European relationship changing under a potential presidency?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, isn't it? And I would expect broadly similar. There's a paradox about Kamala Harris, and there's been some talk, hasn't there, about as you say, and I suppose it's resting on this European insecurity about the future. The extent to which Harris will be as Atlanticist as President Biden, and some talk of the fact that she's been less engaged in foreign policy than other potential Democrat candidates who are potentially assuming the presidency. I think that's an unfair characterization. I think she's been very engaged, and obviously as vice president for more than 3 years, she's been in the room on a lot of the key foreign policies. She's attended, as you know, the Munich Security Conference for the last 3 years. So she's travelled to Europe a good deal as vice president. She's certainly articulated a very strong support for NATO, an absolute commitment to the basic foundations of the transatlantic relationship. So I would expect to see broadly the same approach that President Biden has pursued. I think inevitably, though, there will be differences. That's inevitable. Certainly, the view is that she is more interested in using trade as a sort of weapon of extending and promoting democracy. And I think she will look to engage, if she was to be elected as president in November, I think she will look to engage Europe more on the economic side, moving on perhaps from broadening the scope of the US industrial strategy to include European allies more comprehensively than perhaps was done with the Inflation Reduction Act and the Biden reforms 2 or 3 years ago. So I think you're going to see. I think obviously. I think it will be good news for Europe if Harris was to be elected. I think there will still be. It will still be incumbent upon the Europeans to step forward and to take greater control of its own security and all sorts of issues that we know. And I expect Harris, as with Biden, to maintain the pressure on that. But it would be a very different approach to that if Donald Trump is elected. That's for sure. So
to kind of follow up on your answer there, do you think, so you mentioned that the Harris administration's approach to Europe will largely mirror that of the Biden administration's with some differences. What do you think about the security relationship specifically? It seems like the rebalance to the Indo-Pacific region has continued under multiple presidents, started in earnest under the Obama administration, but continued under Trump, continued under Biden. We sort of found ourselves in this scenario where Europe is still heavily dependent on the U.S. for its security guarantees. So I just, like, from your opinion, how do you sort of balance the support of NATO, which is clear and necessary for, I think, global stability, with, I think, a real need to push the Europeans to take on more of a responsibility for themselves? I mean, do you think this is something that Harris would pursue, or from your opinion, potentially should pursue if she wins in November?
So that long-term pivot away from Europe to the Indo-Pacific is a reality which Europeans have been fully aware of for some decades. So that reality is not going to change, and will continue with a Harris presidency. And perhaps one way of looking at the last few years is that the combination of the war in Ukraine and the prospect of a Trump presidency has woken European allies up to the reality that Europe needs to take greater control of its own security. That is the case. Whoever is elected in November, it will be deeply uncomfortable if Trump is elected, and that reality is one that is done in a way that is not, and the fear obviously is done in a way that is not conducive to the health of the alliance. But certainly for Europe, from a European perspective, it would be much preferable to have a Harris presidency. But Europe needs to take greater control of its security. And as I say, I hope that perhaps the unfortunate, dreadful situation in Ukraine, plus the prospect of Trump presidency, may act as a catalyst that Europe has finally woken up to that reality. We'll see. There have been some positive moves, perhaps still some feet dragging, but it's absolutely essential that now Europe takes that on, and it's certainly Europe's interests that if we do have a Harris presidency, which is committed to the alliance, committed to NATO, committed to transatlantic security, that Europe does not take its foot off the gas and continues at a greater pace the need to control and to be in charge of its own security.
So then, last question here, focusing on the UK for a minute. The UK just had a major, how should we put this, landslide in its own politics. After years and years of Tory rule, we now have a new prime minister, Labour, and that kind of opens the door for not only a different strategy by the UK and how it interacts with both Europe and the United States, but also based on who wins in the US, whether it's Trump or Harris, the UK-US relationship could look different. Where do you see specifically the US-UK relationship heading in the next few years? And is it dependent upon who is in the White House or not so much?
It's going to be heavily influenced by I think whoever wins the White House in November, the relationship, the transatlantic relationship, is still a fundamental aspect of, and always will be a fundamental aspect of UK security and wider interests. And you'll see that whatever Harris or Trump presidency. It will inevitably be more difficult under Trump presidency, but those essential aspects of that relationship will be maintained, and I think both sides will have every interest to do so. Inevitably, as you'll have seen that Keir Starmer is in Berlin today, and talk of a new pact with Germany. Certainly, the UK is looking to rebuild its relationship with Europe, and that will. I think that's in the US interests. I think that the US has it's been to the detriment of the US relationship with Europe for the detachment of the UK from the European Union. And interestingly, you see there's quite a lot of commentary from those on the right of the political spectrum in the US that have reflected that actually not having the UK within the European fold has been to the detriment of US interests. So I think you'll see the UK looking to play again, if you like, more of that bridging relationship. And I think particularly in terms of the Harris presidency, where that commitment to the transatlantic relationship is strong, I would hope to see the UK playing a much more active role in wider European security strategy. And I think that's where the UK and the Keir Starmer would like to head. And I think with US if you like, with the US support and US backing, that is one that I think that they will want to play. But under a Trump presidency, it's going to be difficult. The theatre, the noise, everything makes the handling and management of the relationship more difficult. But I still would expect the fundamentals to remain. I think there are going to be some issues, perhaps on the wider. So I think we talked a bit about trade issues a little earlier. I think the UK is embarked on has been looking very carefully at US industrial strategy over the last 3 or 4 years to see whether and have been designing a policy around clean energy transition, which to some extent draws heavily on that Biden experience. And I think that the UK would certainly be looking and it's more likely under Harris presidency, but not completely removed under a Trump presidency, where the UK would expect to see more collaboration in those areas around supply chains for clean energy and in other areas of trade. So I think that the UK will be looking to draw on the advantages that Harris presidency would bring, not least in terms of the political relationship. There's been quite a lot of interchange recently between both on the Labour side and the Democrat side. There were quite a number of senior Labour people at the Democratic convention in Chicago last week talking to the Harris people. I think the Harris people have been quite interested in how Starmer won in London and what are the things that can be learned from the US experience. So I think they've been interested in drawing on that experience. And I think that if there was a Harris White House and a Starmer Downing Street, both sides I think would be looking to get dividends from that in terms of the sort of wider economic and trade issue.
Well, I guess we will find out pretty soon about all of the answers to these questions as we look ahead to the election in the U.S. in November. Ed, thanks so much for joining us, and look forward to continuing the conversation after we have a clear sense of who's going to be in the White House come January 2025. So thanks again, and thanks to our listeners for tuning in.
Thank you.